Section 1. The Ambush at the Sacred Grove. The Swedish raiders had been following the river for 3 days when they saw the smoke. It was autumn in the early 1000s AD, and the raiding party of 40 men had penetrated deeper into Livonian territory than any group that season. Their leader, a veteran warrior named Thorgest, had raided from Dublin to the Black Sea. He knew confidence when he saw it, and he knew fear. The thin column of smoke rising above the forest ahead looked like neither. It looked like carelessness. A single hearth, one of his men observed, checking the wind direction, maybe 2 families. Thorgest studied the landscape. Dense forest pressed close on both sides of the river, the kind of ancient growth that swallowed sound and sight. The water ran dark and cold, already carrying the promise of the brutal winter to come, but the river was their highway, and their 3 longships were their advantage: speed, surprise, and steel. The formula had worked everywhere from the coast of Francia to the trading posts along the Volga. "We take them quickly," Thorgest said. "Slaves and supplies. Then we're gone before sunset." What Thorgest couldn't see was that the smoke had been lit specifically for him to see, and that in the forest on both sides of the river, more than 200 warriors had been tracking his ships since dawn. The settlement appeared around the river's bend, exactly as expected. A cluster of wooden structures, a few small boats pulled onto the shore, the smoke rising from a central fire. No fortifications, no lookouts that the Swedes could spot. The raiders smiled. This was going to be easy. They beached their longships on the muddy bank and moved quickly up the slope. Thorgest led from the front, his warriors spreading into their practiced formation. They'd done this hundreds of times. Secure the perimeter, round up anyone who runs, take what's valuable, burn what's not. The first house they kicked open was empty. So was the second. And the third. Thorgest's veteran instincts screamed a warning half a heartbeat before the forest erupted. But half a heartbeat wasn't enough. The javelins came first. Not the wild throws of panicked defenders, but the coordinated volley of disciplined warriors who'd trained their entire lives. They arced out of the tree line from 3 sides, a rain of ash, wood, and iron that found gaps in shields and spaces between men. 7 Swedes went down in the first seconds. The javelins were short and heavy, designed to punch through armor at close range, and they did exactly that. Thorgest shouted for his men to form a shield wall, the classic Viking defensive maneuver that had saved countless warbands. For a moment, it looked like it might work. The raiders locked their shields together, bristling with weapons, presenting the solid front that had broken armies across Europe. Then the forest came alive. What emerged from the trees wasn't a disorganized mob of tribal warriors. It was a coordinated assault from multiple directions, executed with the precision of professionals. Livonian fighters poured from concealed positions that must have been prepared days in advance. They moved through the terrain like water, using every tree, every depression in the ground, every shadow. They didn't charge into the shield wall. They pulled it apart. Groups of 3 or 4 warriors focused on individual Swedes at the edges of the formation. Long spears jabbed at legs and arms, forcing shields up or to the side. The moment a gap appeared, a warrior would dart in with an axe or sword, strike, and fade back before the Vikings could respond. It was the tactic of hunters who'd spent generations bringing down elk and bear in these same forests, now applied to men in chainmail. The shield wall began to fragment. Thorgest fought, like the veteran he was, his sword finding flesh more than once. But for every Livonian who fell, 2 more appeared, and they were using the terrain in ways the Swedes couldn't counter. Warriors would attack from behind trees, then melt back into the forest before a Viking could pursue. Others used the slopes and depressions of the ground to attack from unexpected angles. Then Thorgest heard something that made his blood freeze. The longships were burning. While the Swedes had been focused on the settlement, another group of Livonians had circled behind them. The 3 ships that represented escape, wealth, and status were now columns of flame and smoke. The carefully crafted oak, the months of work, the pride of Swedish shipbuilding, all consumed in minutes. There would be no retreat to the water. There would be no escape downriver. There would be no returning home to tell this story. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Viking warriors fought best when they believed they could win, or at least survive. Now they knew neither was possible. Some broke and ran for the forest. The Livonians let them go, knowing what awaited in those woods. Others fought with the desperate fury of doomed men, selling their lives as expensively as they could. Thorgest saw one of his best men, a Norwegian giant who'd survived a dozen battles, dragged down by 4 Livonian warriors working in perfect coordination. He watched another Swede take a javelin through the throat as he tried to shield a wounded companion. The ground was becoming slick with blood, both Swedish and Livonian, but the balance was brutally clear. The battle lasted less than an hour, from first javelin to final blow. When it ended, the only sounds were the crackling of burning ships and the calls of crows gathering in the trees above. The Livonians moved through the aftermath with practiced efficiency. They collected their dead and wounded first, treating them with a reverence that spoke of deep cultural bonds. The Swedish dead they stripped of anything useful: weapons, armour, tools, even the silver arm rings that marked status and wealth. Everything was taken. The bodies themselves were left where they fell. This wasn't about trophies or glory. This was about sending a message. Over the following days and weeks, other Swedish raiders would find the site. They'd see the burned ships, the scattered bones, the clear evidence of a massacre. Some would bury their countrymen. Others would flee immediately, carrying stories back to Sweden about the eastern forests where warrior spirits dwelt among the trees and entire raiding parties vanished like smoke. But here's what makes this story remarkable. Despite the scale of the defeat, despite the loss of 40 experienced warriors, despite the burning of 3 longships, you won't find this battle mentioned in a single Norse saga. There's no skaldic poem about Thorgest's last stand, no runestone raised in Sweden commemorating the fallen. The battle that ended a raiding season and sent shockwaves through the Swedish warrior community simply doesn't exist in the written record. Why? Because the victors didn't write. They sang. They told stories around fires, passed down through generations in languages that would eventually be forgotten. They carved symbols into trees in sacred groves that would later be cut down by Christian crusaders. They wove their victories into the fabric of their oral tradition, a tradition that wouldn't survive the coming centuries of conquest and conversion. The Livonians won the battle, but they lost the memory. This is the story of how one of history's most effective resistance movements against Viking expansion was almost completely erased from historical memory. It's about fierce warriors who defended their homeland with skill and courage that would rival any celebrated in Norse sagas. It's about how the absence of writing doesn't mean the absence of sophistication, strategy, or success. It's about the brutal tribes the Vikings feared to fight, and how their stories were left out of the sagas written by the men they defeated. Because sometimes the most effective warriors are the ones history forgets to mention. Section 2. The Setup. Sweden's Eastern Ambitions. To understand why Swedish Vikings kept pushing into the eastern Baltic despite mounting losses, you need to understand what drove them east in the first place. And to understand that, we need to talk about the Viking world in the 900s and 1000s AD, when expansion had become not just profitable, but essential to Swedish power and prestige. While their Norwegian and Danish cousins were busy terrorizing the coasts of England, Ireland, and Francia, the Swedish Vikings were looking in a completely different direction, east. The Swedes who ventured into the Baltic weren't acting randomly. They were part of a sophisticated trade network that stretched from Scandinavia through what would become Russia, all the way to the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic Caliphate. These Eastern Vikings, sometimes called Varangians or Rus, had discovered something their Western counterparts were just beginning to learn. Conquest was profitable, but trade could make you rich. The Eastern route offered treasures that Western Europe simply couldn't match. Arab silver flowed north through intermediaries, so much of it that Swedish graves from this period are filled with Islamic coins. Furs from the northern forests, sable and ermine and fox, commanded extraordinary prices in Constantinople and Baghdad. Amber from the Baltic coast was worth its weight in gold in southern markets. Slaves, captured in raids or bought from other tribes, could be sold for fortunes in the great cities of the south. And honey. The medieval world ran on honey, the only reliable sweetener and the base for mead, and the forests of the east produced it in quantities that made merchants wealthy. But there was a problem, a geographic problem, and that problem was shaped exactly like modern Latvia and Estonia. Look at a map of the Baltic Sea, and you'll see the issue immediately. Swedish traders, wanting to move south and east, had to pass through a coastal corridor controlled by peoples who had no particular reason to let them through peacefully. The Livonians occupied the coast and river valleys of what's now Latvia and southern Estonia. Inland from them, the Semigallians controlled vital river routes and overland passages. Further north, other Finnic and Baltic tribes held their own territories with equal determination. These weren't empty lands waiting to be claimed. They were populated, organized, and firmly held by peoples who'd been there for thousands of years. The Swedish solution, at first, was the solution Vikings knew best: force. In the 900s AD, Swedish raiders began probing the eastern Baltic coast with increasing frequency. They built temporary camps, raided settlements for supplies and slaves, and tried to establish the kind of dominance they were achieving elsewhere. The logic was simple and had worked across the Viking world. Show up with superior weapons and organization, demonstrate overwhelming force a few times, and the local population would either flee, submit, or become trading partners on Viking terms. The early raids seemed to confirm this approach. Small Livonian and Estonian coastal settlements could be overwhelmed by a well-armed raiding party. Ships could be beached, a quick strike executed, and the raiders gone before any organized response materialized. Swedish warriors returned home with amber, furs, and slaves, telling stories of easy pickings in the eastern forests. But these early successes were misleading. The coastal raids were hitting the edges of Livonian and Semigallian territory, the frontier settlements that were always most vulnerable. The Swedish Vikings were making the same mistake that countless invaders throughout history have made. They were confusing the ability to raid with the ability to conquer. They were mistaking tactical victories for strategic dominance. What they didn't understand yet was that every raid was being carefully observed, every tactic noted, every weakness identified. The tribes of the eastern Baltic weren't cowering in fear. They were learning. By the late 900s and early 1000s AD, Swedish ambitions in the region were intensifying. This wasn't just about raiding anymore. Swedish jarls and chieftains began to envision something more permanent. Trading posts that could be defended year-round, settlements that could control river access, perhaps even tributary relationships where local tribes would pay for the privilege of Swedish protection. This model was working brilliantly for the Swedish Rus further east. The principalities of Novgorod and Kiev had been established by Swedish warriors who'd inserted themselves into Slavic territories as a ruling elite. They'd created hybrid societies, Swedish leadership over Slavic populations, that controlled lucrative trade routes and became wealthy beyond the dreams of farmers back in Sweden. Why couldn't the same approach work in Livonia? The answer involved a combination of geography, culture, and timing that Swedish strategists badly misjudged. First, the geography. Sweden itself is a land of forests, but the Swedish forests are relatively manageable. There are clearings, established paths, areas of settlement, connected by known routes. The eastern Baltic was something else entirely. Imagine forests so dense that daylight barely penetrates the canopy. Ancient growth where trees have stood for centuries, their branches interlocking overhead to create a permanent twilight below. And not just forests, but wetlands, marshes, bogs, where the ground itself could swallow a man in armor. Rivers that looked navigable would suddenly narrow into rapids or split into countless channels through impassable swamps. This was terrain that nullified many Viking advantages. Longships were magnificent on open water and navigable rivers, but they were vulnerable in narrow channels where ambushes could come from both banks. Viking warriors fought best in open terrain where their shield wall tactics and superior equipment could dominate. The eastern forests offered almost no such terrain. Swedish raiders who ventured inland found themselves in a nightmare landscape. Every river bend could hide an ambush. Every forest track could lead to a dead end or a prepared killing ground. The locals could move through this terrain with ease, appearing and disappearing like ghosts. The Swedes, weighed down with armor and weapons designed for different warfare, struggled with every step. Then there was the cultural factor. The peoples of the eastern Baltic weren't unified under strong kings or jarls who could be intimidated or negotiated with. They were organized in tribal confederations with diffuse leadership. There was no single throat to cut, no capital to capture, no king whose submission would bring peace. If you defeated one Livonian warband, 3 more would appear from different villages. If you burned one Semigallian settlement, the survivors would scatter into the forest and return with reinforcements from allied tribes. This decentralized structure, which looked like weakness to Viking eyes accustomed to hierarchical societies, was actually a profound strength. You couldn't behead the resistance because there was no single head, but perhaps the most critical factor was one the Swedes completely failed to appreciate: the spiritual dimension. The Livonians, Semigallians, and other Baltic tribes were deeply, fundamentally pagan in ways that even Viking paganism couldn't match. Their entire worldview was built around sacred groves, holy rivers, and the spirits that dwelt in the land itself. These weren't just religious beliefs in an abstract sense. They were the organizing principle of society, the source of legal authority, and the foundation of identity. When Swedish Christians or even Swedish pagans attacked these territories, they weren't just fighting for land or trade routes, they were attacking the sacred itself. And people will fight differently, harder, more desperately, when they believe they're defending the homes of their gods. The Swedish Vikings of the 1000s AD didn't understand any of this at first. They saw scattered tribes practicing primitive religions in difficult terrain. They expected to apply the same formula that had worked from England to Byzantium: superior weapons, bold tactics, and the reputation of Viking invincibility would carry the day. They were about to learn a very hard lesson about the difference between raiding and conquering, between winning battles and controlling territory, between defeating warriors and breaking the spirit of a people who refused to be broken. The early 1000s AD saw a steady increase in Swedish attempts to penetrate deeper into Livonian and Semigallian territory. Larger raiding parties, better equipped, more experienced. Veterans who'd fought across Europe brought their expertise east. The confidence was palpable. These were men who'd defeated English armies, who'd extracted tribute from Frankish kings, who'd served in the Varangian Guard of the Byzantine Emperor. How hard could it be to subdue some forest tribes who didn't even have a written language? They were about to find out. Because while the Swedish Vikings had been conquering their way across the known world, the peoples of the eastern Baltic had been perfecting the art of making invaders disappear into forests that kept their secrets. They'd been developing tactics specifically designed to negate Viking advantages and exploit Viking weaknesses. They'd been preparing for exactly this kind of confrontation for generations. The collision, when it came in full force during the 1000s AD, would shatter Swedish assumptions about their own invincibility, and it would teach a lesson that took decades and countless lives to learn. Some fights aren't worth winning, and some peoples simply cannot be conquered, no matter how many ships you bring or how sharp your swords. The Swedish Vikings were about to meet their match in the dark forests of the east, and the tribes waiting for them in those forests had been ready for a very long time. Section 3. The Resistance, the forgotten warriors of the Baltic. When Swedish Vikings first encountered the Livonians, they made a fatal assumption. They saw people who lived in wooden settlements, who didn't build stone fortifications, who had no written language, and they concluded these were primitive peoples who would fall easily to superior Scandinavian warfare. They couldn't have been more wrong. The Livonians and Semigallians weren't primitive, they were specialized, and they'd spent centuries perfecting exactly the kind of warfare that would make Viking conquest impossible. Let's start with the Livonians, because understanding who they were requires us to completely rethink what we mean by advanced civilization. The Livonians were a Finnic people who'd inhabited the coastal regions and river valleys of what's now Latvia and southern Estonia for thousands of years. By the time Swedish Vikings started probing their territory in the 900s AD, Livonian society had developed a sophisticated balance between settlement, agriculture, hunting, trading, and warfare that was perfectly adapted to their environment. Their language was related to Finnish and Estonian, part of the Finno-Ugric family that stretched across northern Europe. This linguistic connection reflected deeper cultural and trade networks. The Livonians weren't isolated forest dwellers. They were part of a vast exchange system that moved goods and ideas across the Baltic world. Amber from their shores reached as far as Rome during the height of the empire. Furs from their forests were prized in Byzantium. They knew about the wider world, traded with it, and had no interest in being conquered by it. Livonian metalworking was particularly advanced. Archaeological excavations have revealed iron tools and weapons of remarkable quality. Their smiths understood advanced smelting techniques and could work both iron and bronze with considerable skill. The weapons they carried into battle weren't crude clubs and stone axes. They were well-forged spears, swords, and axes that could match Swedish steel blow for blow. Their settlements reflected a society that valued both community and defense. Livonian hill forts, built on elevated ground and reinforced with timber and earthworks, weren't the simple wooden palisades that Vikings might have expected. They were complex defensive structures with multiple layers, hidden entrances, and sightlines carefully calculated to give defenders maximum advantage. These weren't thrown up in response to Viking raids. They'd been refined over generations of warfare with neighbouring tribes. But what really set the Livonians apart was their relationship with the land itself. Every river, every grove, every unusual rock formation had spiritual significance. The forests weren't just resources to be exploited. They were sacred spaces inhabited by spirits who had to be respected and honoured. Certain groves were so holy that entering them without proper ritual could mean death. These weren't superstitions in the way we might understand the term. They were the organizing principle of Livonian society, the source of their laws, and the foundation of their identity. This spiritual connection gave Livonian warriors something that Swedish Vikings, for all their reputation, couldn't match. They were fighting on sacred ground, defending the literal homes of their gods. Every tree could be a spirit's dwelling. Every stream could be blessed by ancient powers. When you fight with that kind of conviction, on terrain, you know with spiritual intimacy, you become almost impossible to defeat. The Livonians were also politically sophisticated in ways the Swedes misunderstood. They weren't unified under a single king, which looked like weakness to Viking eyes. But their system of village councils and regional assemblies that could coordinate for defense was actually more flexible than rigid hierarchical structures. You couldn't cut off the head of Livonian resistance because leadership was distributed. If one village was destroyed, 5 others would carry on the fight. If one chief fell in battle, the council would simply choose another. Then there were the Semigallians. If the Livonians were sophisticated defenders of sacred spaces, the Semigallians were something else entirely. They were the warriors that other warriors feared. The Semigallians were a Baltic people, linguistically related to modern Latvians and Lithuanians, who controlled the interior regions west and south of Livonian territory. While the Livonians were Finnic, the Semigallians were Baltic, but the two groups had been neighbours, sometimes allies, sometimes enemies, for so long that they developed similar approaches to warfare and similar determination to remain independent. Even other Baltic tribes spoke of the Semigallians with a mixture of respect and caution. These were people who'd earned a reputation for ferocity that extended far beyond their actual territory. Later Christian chronicles, written by crusaders who fought the Semigallians in the 1200s AD, describe them as the most warlike and dangerous of all the Baltic peoples. That's a remarkable statement coming from men who were trying to justify their own violence. What made the Semigallians so formidable? First, they were exceptional horsemen. While the Livonians fought primarily on foot, using terrain and ambush tactics, the Semigallians had developed cavalry traditions that rivaled anything in medieval Europe. Their light cavalry could strike with devastating speed, then vanish before a counterattack could be organized. This mobility, combined with intimate knowledge of the landscape, made them nearly impossible to pin down in battle. Semigallian warriors, trained from childhood in a culture that celebrated martial prowess above almost everything else. A man's status in Semigallian society was determined largely by his success in warfare. This created a warrior class that was highly motivated, exceptionally skilled, and absolutely fearless in combat. They weren't fighting for pay or plunder, though both were welcome. They were fighting for honor in a society where honor was measured in battle. Their tactics were brutal, even by the violent standards of the medieval world. Semigallian warriors were known for taking no prisoners except for ransom or slaves. Enemies who surrendered could expect death rather than mercy. This wasn't mindless cruelty. It was calculated psychological warfare. If your enemies know that capture means certain death, they fight differently. They panic more easily. They break more quickly when the battle turns against them. The Semigallians also used scorched earth tactics with ruthless efficiency. When a Swedish raiding party penetrated their territory, Semigallian defenders would evacuate villages, drive off livestock, and burn anything that couldn't be moved. The invaders would find empty settlements and bare larders. Then, when the Vikings were far from their ships and supplies, weakened by hunger and constant harassment, the Semigallians would strike in force. But perhaps the most important factor that united both Livonians and Semigallians was something the Swedish Vikings completely failed to anticipate. These traditional enemies would unite against outside threats. In times of peace, Livonian and Semigallian villages might raid each other, dispute over hunting grounds, or engage in the kind of low-level warfare that characterized tribal societies across medieval Europe. But when Swedish ships appeared on the horizon, ancient feuds were set aside. The appearance of a common enemy triggered cooperation that transformed isolated tribal groups into a coordinated defensive network. This wasn't formal alliance in the way we might understand it. There were no written treaties, no diplomatic protocols. It was something deeper and more organic. Shared language families, centuries of trade and intermarriage, and common spiritual beliefs created bonds that could be activated when survival demanded it. A Livonian village under attack could send runners to Semigallian allies. Semigallian warriors pursuing Swedish raiders could coordinate with Livonian forces to cut off escape routes. The decentralized nature of both societies, which looked like a weakness, became a strength. The Swedish Vikings couldn't break this resistance by defeating any single army or capturing any specific stronghold. It was like fighting fog. Strike in one place, and the resistance simply reformed elsewhere. Now here's where the story becomes tragic. Everything I've just described about Livonian and Semigallian society, their sophistication, their tactics, their spiritual beliefs, comes from fragmentary sources. Archaeological evidence, brief mentions in enemy chronicles, linguistic reconstruction, because the Livonians and Semigallians themselves left almost nothing in writing. They relied entirely on oral tradition. Around fires in longhouses during brutal Baltic winters, elders would recite the deeds of ancestors. Songs passed down through generations told of great battles, legendary heroes, and the proper ways to honor the spirits of forest and stream. Young warriors learned tactics and strategy through stories about how previous generations had defeated invaders. Religious knowledge, legal precedents, history itself existed only in human memory and human voice. This oral tradition was rich, complex, and highly developed. The singers and storytellers of Baltic tribes underwent years of training to master their craft. They could recite lineages going back dozens of generations. They could sing battle epics that took entire nights to complete. The knowledge contained in oral tradition was vast, nuanced, and central to cultural survival. But oral tradition has one catastrophic weakness. It's vulnerable to cultural disruption in ways that written records are not. When the Christian Crusades reached the Baltic in the late 1100s and 1200s AD, they brought more than armies. They brought systematic cultural destruction. Sacred groves were cut down, and churches built on their sites. Traditional rituals were banned under pain of death. The old songs were forbidden. Storytellers who continued their craft were persecuted. Children were forcibly baptized and taught to reject the traditions of their parents. Within a few generations, the vast oral literature of the Livonians and Semigallians was simply gone. The songs about defeating Swedish raiders, the tactical knowledge encoded in epic poems, the historical memory of centuries of resistance, all of it vanished like smoke. What survived were the records kept by their enemies. Norse sagas that rarely mentioned defeats in the eastern Baltic. German chronicles written by crusaders who had every reason to portray the peoples they were conquering as primitive pagans in need of Christian salvation. These sources told us the invaders won. They rarely mentioned the times they lost. For centuries, the historical narrative was simple. The Baltic tribes were backward peoples who were eventually civilized by Christian conquest. Their resistance was portrayed as the futile struggles of primitives against the inevitable march of progress. The sophistication of their military tactics, the depth of their spiritual traditions, the effectiveness of their resistance against multiple waves of invaders, all of this was erased or distorted. Only in recent decades has archaeology begun to tell a different story. Excavations across Latvia and Estonia have revealed a picture of Baltic tribal society that contradicts almost everything the written sources suggest. The hill forts weren't simple wooden stockades. They were complex defensive systems that required sophisticated engineering knowledge and coordinated labor. Mass graves of Scandinavian warriors tell of battles that Norse sagas never mentioned. Weapon hoards reveal metalworking skills that rival anything produced in Scandinavia. Trade goods from across the known world demonstrate that these were peoples fully integrated into medieval economic networks. A particularly revealing discovery came in 1998, when archaeologists excavating near the Daugava River in Latvia found a mass grave containing the remains of approximately 20 warriors. The skeletal analysis, weapons, and grave goods all indicated these were Scandinavian warriors, probably Swedish, who died violently in the late 1000s or early 1100s AD. They'd been buried quickly, with minimal ceremony, far from home. This wasn't an isolated find. Similar graves have been discovered across the region. Each one represents a story that was never told in the sagas, a raiding party that didn't return, a battle that ended in defeat, evidence of a resistance that history forgot. Recent analysis of Livonian and Semigallian defensive structures has revealed something even more interesting. These weren't reactive defenses thrown up in response to Viking raids. The engineering shows evidence of long-term planning and multiple phases of construction. The placement of hill forts and the sight lines between them suggest a coordinated defensive network. These peoples had been preparing for invasion for generations, refining their tactics, learning from each encounter. The more we excavate, the more we find evidence of a sophisticated military culture that successfully resisted one of the most effective warrior societies in medieval Europe. The Livonians and Semigallians didn't just fight back against Swedish Vikings. They fought back effectively enough that Swedish expansion in the region was permanently limited. They created a reputation fearsome enough that later Norse sources occasionally refer to the eastern Baltic as a place where warriors go to die, and they did all of this while leaving almost no written record of their own achievements. That's the real tragedy here. The Livonians and Semigallians weren't conquered by Swedish Vikings because the Swedish Vikings couldn't conquer them. When these peoples finally fell, centuries later, it was to the combined forces of German crusading knights, overwhelming military technology, and systematic cultural destruction that specifically targeted their oral traditions. By the time anyone thought to write down their stories, there was no one left who remembered them. What we're left with is shadows and silence. Archaeological evidence of battles that no saga mentions, graves of warriors whose names are lost, the physical remains of a resistance so effective that it kept Swedish expansion at bay for centuries, yet so thoroughly erased from historical memory that most people have never heard of it. The Livonians and Semigallians won their wars against the Vikings, but they lost the longer war against historical memory. And in many ways, that second defeat was more complete than any battlefield loss could ever be. Section 4. The Clash. 2 stories of blood and snow. The conflicts between Swedish Vikings and the Baltic tribes weren't single dramatic battles that decided the fate of nations. They were grinding, brutal encounters that played out over decades, each one teaching the Swedes a lesson they refused to learn. Let me tell you about 2 of these encounters in detail, reconstructed from archaeological evidence, scattered references in later sources, and what we understand about warfare in this region and period. These stories aren't in the Norse sagas, but the bodies buried in Baltic soil tell us they happened anyway. Encounter 1. The River of the Dead. In the spring of 1013 AD, a Swedish jarl named Hakon assembled one of the largest raiding forces that had yet ventured into Livonian territory. 70 warriors across 5 longships, veterans, many of them, equipped with the finest weapons Swedish smiths could forge. Hakon himself had raided in England during the campaigns of Sweyn Forkbeard. He'd fought in the Byzantine service. He was no green youth seeking glory. He was a professional who understood warfare. His objective was ambitious, but, he believed, achievable. Penetrate deep into Livonian territory via the Daugava River, establish a fortified trading post at a strategic location, and use it as a base to extract tribute from surrounding villages. The model had worked for Swedish Rus further east. It would work here. The early stages went exactly as planned. The Longships moved upriver in late April, when spring floods made the Daugava navigable deep into the interior. Hakon's force was large enough to deter any immediate attack and mobile enough to avoid getting bogged down. They raided several small settlements along the riverbanks, taking supplies, amber, and a few slaves. The resistance was minimal, a few arrows from the tree line, quickly suppressed. Some warriors glimpsed in the forest, but they melted away before the Swedes could engage. Hakon interpreted this as fear. It was actually reconnaissance. Every move the Swedish force made was being observed and reported. Livonian scouts tracked them from the forest, noting their numbers, their equipment, their tactics, their apparent destination. Runners carried this information to villages throughout the region. Councils met and made decisions. Warriors were summoned. Ancient signal systems, smoke by day and fire by night, spread the word faster than any messenger could travel. The Livonians were preparing a welcome. After 10 days on the river, Hakon found what he was looking for. A natural harbour where the Daugava widened, protected by elevated ground that would be perfect for fortifications, and surrounded by forests that could provide timber for building. Several Livonian settlements were visible in the distance, close enough to trade with or raid, far enough that they couldn't threaten a fortified position. It was perfect. Too perfect. Hakon beached his ships and set his men to work. Some began felling trees for a palisade. Others scouted the immediate area. A few took a boat upriver to check the approaches. The mood was confident, almost celebratory. They'd penetrated further into Livonian territory than any Swedish force in recent memory, and they'd done it with minimal casualties. The attack came on the third day, at dawn, from a direction the Swedes hadn't even considered. The Livonians emerged from the river itself. Small boats, little more than dugout canoes, had been hidden in the reeds and marshes that lined both banks. They'd been there for days, waiting silently, warriors lying in the bottoms of the boats covered with marsh grass, barely breathing. At the signal, dozens of these boats pushed out simultaneously, converging on the beached longships from both sides. The first warning Hakon had was the sound of axes biting into wood, not the wood of trees, but the wood of his ships. The Livonian warriors weren't trying to capture the longships. They were destroying them, systematically, methodically, using axes and adzes to hole the holes below the waterline, smashing steering oars, cutting rigging. It was over in minutes. 5 proud longships, each representing months of skilled labour and significant wealth, rendered useless before the Swedish guards could mount an effective defence. Hakon screamed orders, trying to organise a response, but the Livonians were already withdrawing. Their small boats, light and manoeuvrable, disappeared back into the reeds, faster than the armoured Swedes could pursue. A few Swedish warriors splashed into the shallows after them and were immediately hit by arrows from concealed positions along the bank. The psychological impact was immediate. The ships weren't just transportation, they were escape, wealth, status, connection to home. Without them, the Swedes were stranded deep in hostile territory, with no way out except their feet. Hakon made the decision that any experienced commander would make: abandon the settlement plan and march downstream along the riverbank back to the coast. It would take weeks. They'd have to fight or evade hostile forces the entire way, but it was the only option. The Livonians had been counting on exactly this decision. The march began within the hour, 70 men in battle formation, moving through terrain that grew more difficult with every mile. The Livonians harassed them constantly, but never committed to a full engagement. Arrows from the tree line, javelins thrown from cover, carefully felled trees blocking the path, forcing the Swedes to waste precious time and energy clearing obstacles. This wasn't random harassment, it was choreographed exhaustion. Every obstacle forced the Swedes to slow down, to bunch up, to tire themselves with heavy labour, while their enemies watched from safety. The terrain itself became a weapon. Marshes appeared where none had been on the journey upriver, forcing detours that added miles and hours. Streams that had been ankle-deep were now waist-high, and Swedish warriors in mail armour struggled across them while lightly equipped Livonians watched and waited. Food became a critical issue. The Swedes had brought supplies for a settlement expedition, not a forced march through hostile territory. They'd expected to supplement with hunting and foraging, but the forest was eerily empty of game. Every fish trap they found was broken. Every berry patch had been stripped. The Livonians had cleared the land of anything edible, denying the invaders the resources of the territory itself. After 5 days of this grinding march, Hakon's force reached the Narrows. The Daugava River, wide and navigable for most of its length, constricted at several points where ancient geological forces had created natural bottlenecks. The narrowest of these was a stretch perhaps 30 metres across, with steep banks on both sides and fast-flowing water between. To continue downstream, the Swedes would have to pass through this natural choke point. The Livonians had been preparing the ambush for 3 days. The banks on both sides had been reinforced with concealed fighting positions. Trees had been partially cut so they could be quickly felled across the Swedish line of march. Rocks had been piled at the top of the slopes, ready to be rolled down on command, and more than 300 Livonian warriors from a dozen different villages were waiting in absolute silence, having taken their positions during the night. This was the killing ground. This was where the lesson would be taught. Hakon's scouts reported the Narrows ahead, but they reported nothing unusual. The Livonian camouflage was too good, their discipline too perfect. The Swedish force, entered the narrows in column formation, the only formation possible in the confined space. The Livonians let them get halfway through. Then the forest erupted with coordinated violence that would have done credit to any professional army in medieval Europe. The first wave was rocks and logs, rolled and pushed from the heights above. They crashed into the Swedish column with devastating effect, breaking bones, crushing skulls, creating immediate chaos. Men who'd been marching in formation were suddenly scattered, disorganized, trying to maintain footing on steep slopes, while boulders the size of barrels crashed through their ranks. The second wave was javelins. Not thrown randomly, but in coordinated volleys, 300 warriors throwing at the same moment, then retrieving and throwing again. The air filled with missiles. Shields could block one, maybe two, but the sheer volume overwhelmed defences. Men went down, stuck with multiple javelins, the weight of the weapons dragging their shields down and exposing them to the next volley. The third wave was the warriors themselves. The Livonians didn't charge into a massive melee. They'd learned from previous encounters that the Swedish shield wall was formidable in open combat. Instead, they used the terrain and their numbers to isolate small groups of Swedes and destroy them systematically. A dozen Livonian warriors would focus on 3 or 4 Swedes cut off from the main group. Long spears would keep the Swedes at bay, while axes and swords struck from angles the shields couldn't cover. The moment that group was down, the Livonians would shift to another isolated cluster. It was butcher's work, methodical and brutal. Hakon fought like the veteran he was. He rallied perhaps 20 men around him and formed a shield wall on a slight rise in the terrain, the classic defensive formation. For a moment, it looked like it might hold. The Livonians trying to assault it frontally were taking casualties. Then the fire arrows began. The Livonians weren't trying to kill with the fire. They were creating smoke, thick and choking, that rolled across the Swedish position. The wind, of course, was blowing from the Livonian positions toward the Swedes. Whether this was luck or whether the Livonians had waited for the right wind direction, the effect was devastating. The Swedes, already exhausted from days of marching and fighting, now couldn't breathe or see. Their eyes watered, they coughed and gasped. The shield wall broke, not from direct assault, but from simple inability to maintain formation while choking on smoke. And once it broke, the end came quickly. Small groups of Swedes tried to flee into the forest and were hunted down. Others tried to surrender and were killed where they stood. A few threw themselves into the river, hoping to swim downstream, and drowned in their armour, or were pulled under by the current. Hakon himself died fighting, his sword red with Livonian blood, surrounded by the bodies of his personal guard. He'd killed perhaps 6 or 7 enemies in the final moments, but there were simply too many. A Semigallian warrior, riding with the Livonian forces as part of the coordinated defence, put a spear through Hakon's throat. The Jarl who'd fought from Dublin to Byzantium died in a forest whose name he never learned, killed by an enemy whose name history didn't record. The Battle of the Narrows, as we might call it, lasted less than 2 hours from first boulder to final blow. Of Hakon's 70 warriors, perhaps 3 or 4 escaped the killing ground. They fled separately through the forest, hunted, but eventually given up for lost. They straggled back to the Baltic coast over the following weeks, alone or in pairs, and eventually found their way home to Sweden. They brought stories of demons in the forest, of enemies who emerged from the earth itself, of rivers that ran red with Swedish blood. But they brought no glory, no plunder, and no bodies to bury properly. Most critically, they brought no ships, because the ships had been destroyed on the 3rd day of the expedition. Archaeological evidence for this battle was discovered in 1998 when a construction project near the Daugava uncovered a mass grave containing the remains of approximately 20 individuals. Forensic analysis determined they were male, aged between 20 and 40, and had died violently from multiple wounds consistent with medieval weapons. The grave goods and weapon fragments identified them as Scandinavian, probably Swedish, and radiocarbon dating placed them in the early to mid-1100s AD. 20 bodies in one grave suggests a much larger battle, as mass graves typically contain only a portion of the dead. The location, near a natural narrows in the river, matches the tactical description. The multiple wounds on the skeletons indicate the victims were overwhelmed by superior numbers. One skull showed evidence of 7 separate blade strikes, suggesting the individual had been surrounded and attacked from multiple directions. This was a massacre, not a battle between equals. And it's not mentioned in a single Norse saga. Encounter 2. The winter campaign that never returned. If the River of the Dead taught the Swedes about Livonian cunning and coordination, the winter campaign taught them about Semigallian endurance and ruthlessness. In the winter of 1049 to 1050 AD, a coalition of Swedish jarls decided that the eastern Baltic required a different approach. Raiding had failed, fortified posts had failed. What was needed was old-fashioned conquest, a force large enough to overwhelm any resistance, equipped for a winter campaign, prepared to stay in the field until the job was done. They assembled 200 warriors. This was a substantial force by any medieval standard, larger than most armies that fought battles remembered in history books. They brought supplies for 3 months. They had interpreters who spoke the local languages. They even had a priest, a sign that this wasn't just about plunder, but about establishing permanent Swedish Christian presence in pagan territory. The leadership fell to a jarl named Styrbjorn, whose father had successfully established a trading post among the Slavs to the east. Styrbjorn had spent time in that settlement and understood, or thought he understood, how to transform conquest into sustainable control. The strategy was straightforward. March inland in force, destroy any organized resistance, establish fortified winter quarters, and spend the cold months demonstrating that Swedish rule was inevitable and resistance was futile. The campaign began in November, when the ground had frozen hard enough to support armoured men and the rivers were still navigable. The Swedish force moved inland along a different route than Hakon's doomed expedition 30 years earlier, learning at least some lessons from that disaster. They travelled in tight formation, kept scouts well ahead, and avoided obvious ambush points. For the first 2 weeks, they encountered almost no resistance. A few abandoned villages, some forest trails, no sign of organised opposition. Styrbjorn interpreted this as success. His father had told him that native peoples would retreat before overwhelming force and eventually come to terms. The key was to look strong and be patient. What Styrbjorn didn't understand was that the Semigallians and their Livonian allies weren't retreating in fear. They were implementing a strategy they'd refined over generations of intertribal warfare and then adapted specifically for dealing with foreign invaders. It was called, in the language that history didn't preserve, something that translates roughly to "let the forest eat them." The strategy had 3 phases. Phase 1 was evacuation. Every Semigallian and Livonian village in the Swedish line of march had been warned weeks in advance. The inhabitants packed everything portable, drove their livestock into the deep forests, and abandoned their homes. They left nothing behind that could feed or shelter invaders. Buildings were emptied. Food caches were relocated. Even firewood was carried away. The Swedes would find villages, but they'd find them useless. Phase 2 was denial. Anything that couldn't be evacuated was destroyed. Fishing weirs were broken. Hunting trails were obscured. Stores of food that couldn't be moved were burned or buried. The goal was to turn the territory itself into a weapon against the invaders. Let them march through lands that offered nothing but cold, hunger, and emptiness. Phase 3 was harassment. Small groups of Semigallian warriors, rarely more than 5 or 6 men, would shadow the Swedish force constantly. They'd shoot arrows into the camp at night, forcing the Swedes to maintain exhausting guard rotations. They'd ambush, foraging parties that ventured from the main group. They'd make noise in the forest, drums and horns, creating the impression of vast forces gathering just beyond sight. The goal wasn't to defeat the Swedes in battle. It was to terrify them, exhaust them, and slowly break their will to continue. By mid-December, Styrbjorn's campaign was in serious trouble. The supplies brought from Sweden were running low. The expected resupply through local foraging had failed because there was nothing to forage. The horses they'd brought were dying from lack of proper feed. The cold was brutal, worse than Swedish winters, because the dampness of the Baltic forests penetrated everything. Men were getting sick. Frostbite was claiming fingers and toes. And every single night, the drums in the forest reminded them that they were being watched. Styrbjorn made the decision to establish winter quarters and wait out the worst of the cold. His men built a fortified camp in a defensible position, surrounded it with ditches and palisades, and prepared to endure. The plan was to survive the winter, then resume the campaign in spring when supplies could be brought upriver. The Semigallians had been waiting for exactly this decision. A fortified camp that doesn't move is a camp that can be surrounded, isolated, and slowly strangled. While the Swedes huddled behind their palisades, Semigallian warriors and their allies established positions in a wide ring around the camp. They weren't close enough to be seen or attacked, but they were close enough to intercept any attempt at resupply or escape. The siege, if we can call it that, lasted through December and into January. The Swedes inside the fort ate through their remaining supplies. They tried to hunt, but game was nowhere to be found, driven away deliberately by the besiegers. They tried to forage, but every party that ventured into the forest was ambushed. Small groups of 3 or 4 men would leave and simply never return, their bodies left in the snow as warnings. The psychological pressure was perhaps worse than the physical deprivation. Every night, the Semigallians would move closer to the fort under cover of darkness and leave tokens, broken weapons, pieces of Swedish equipment taken from dead foragers, sometimes just footprints in the snow around the palisade, proof that the enemy could approach at will. The message was clear. You are surrounded. You are being watched. You are already dead. By late January, men were dying of starvation and disease inside the fort. Styrbjorn faced an impossible choice. Stay and watch his force disintegrate, or attempt a breakout march through hostile territory in the depths of winter with weakened men and no supplies. He chose the breakout. In early February of 1050 AD, the Swedish force abandoned their fort and began marching northwest toward the coast, hoping to reach the sea and find friendly ships or settlements. They travelled in a tight defensive formation, 200 men who'd been reduced to perhaps 150 effectives, leaving their sick and dying behind because they simply couldn't be carried. The Semigallians followed, not attacking directly, not yet, just following, staying just within sight, a constant presence on the flanks and rear of the Swedish column. When the Swedes stopped to rest, the Semigallians stopped. When the Swedes marched, the Semigallians marched. The psychological effect was devastating. The Swedes knew they were being herded like animals towards some predetermined slaughter. The actual attacks began 3 days into the march. Small, vicious encounters where half a dozen Semigallian warriors would strike at stragglers, kill them, and disappear before help could arrive. The Swedish column grew shorter with each attack, like a snake being eaten from the tail forward. Styrbjorn tried to maintain discipline, but exhausted. Starving men can only be pushed so far. The column began to fragment. Some men, convinced they'd die anyway, dropped their weapons and tried to flee into the forest, hoping to hide or surrender. The Semigallians hunted them down methodically. Other men, too weak to continue, simply sat in the snow and waited for death. The Semigallians obliged them. By the time the Swedish force reached the coast in late February, fewer than 40 men remained. They were skeletons in armour, frostbitten, starving, broken in spirit. Some of them found passage on trading ships. Others settled in coastal communities, too ashamed or too traumatized to return home. A handful, including Styrbjorn himself, made it back to Sweden that spring. Styrbjorn lived for another 20 years, but he never spoke in detail about the winter campaign. When pressed, he would only say that the eastern forests were cursed, and that no Swedish force should venture there again. He never raided again. He never led warriors. The man who'd commanded 200 veterans and planned to establish a Swedish domain in the east became a farmer who avoided even the mention of the lands beyond the Baltic. Of the 200 men who'd marched inland with such confidence in November, perhaps 1 in 5 returned home. There was no mass grave to mark their passing, no archaeological evidence to pin down exactly where and how they died. They simply vanished into the winter forests, their bones scattered across hundreds of miles of territory, their names forgotten, their fate mentioned in no saga. But the impact rippled through Swedish society. The loss of 200 warriors, an entire generation of fighting men from multiple communities, couldn't be hidden. Villages that had sent their best young men on the winter campaign received back only a handful of traumatized survivors, or no one at all. The economic impact of losing so many workers and warriors was significant. And the psychological impact was perhaps even greater. The Semigallians had done something remarkable. They'd taken everything Vikings were good at, speed, shock, surprise, and made it irrelevant. They'd fought on their terms, in their territory, using tactics that Vikings had no effective counter for. And they'd made an example that discouraged further attempts at conquest for decades. The pattern. These two encounters, separated by almost 40 years, reveal a consistent pattern in how the Baltic tribes fought against Swedish expansion. First, they refused to fight on Viking terms. Open field battles where superior Swedish equipment and shield wall tactics could dominate were avoided at all costs. Instead, the defenders used terrain, ambush, harassment, and psychological warfare to negate Viking advantages. Second, they used the land itself as a weapon. The forests, rivers, marshes, and harsh climate of the Baltic region weren't obstacles to be overcome. They were tools to be exploited. The defenders knew every trail, every river crossing, every place where the terrain could trap or channel invaders. They used this knowledge ruthlessly. Third, they coordinated across tribal boundaries. The traditional view of tribal societies as fragmented and incapable of unified action proved completely wrong in the Baltic context. Livonians and Semigallians, despite being different peoples with different languages, could cooperate effectively when faced with a common threat. This coordination extended to military tactics, information sharing, and strategic planning. Fourth, they fought for sacred ground. This wasn't just about territory or resources. It was about defending the literal homes of their gods. This spiritual dimension gave defenders a level of commitment that economic or political considerations alone couldn't match. Men will fight differently when they believe they're defending the sacred itself. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, they understood that the goal wasn't to defeat every Viking force in battle. The goal was to make the costs of invasion so high, the risks so great, and the psychological burden so heavy that the Vikings would eventually stop coming. They succeeded. By the mid-1100s AD, Swedish attempts to conquer or colonize the eastern Baltic had largely ceased. Individual traders might venture into the region, but they came on Baltic terms, paying tribute or trading peacefully. The large-scale raiding expeditions and attempts at permanent settlement that characterized the early 1100s simply stopped. This was a strategic victory for the Baltic tribes, as significant as any celebrated in Norse sagas. They'd faced one of the most effective warrior cultures in medieval Europe and forced that culture to back down. They'd proven that Viking expansion had clear limits, and that those limits could be enforced by peoples who understood their own strengths and exploited their enemies' weaknesses. But here's the tragedy. While Norse schools were composing epic poems about Viking victories in England and Ireland, No one was recording these defensive victories in the Baltic. While Christian monks were writing chronicles about the expansion of Christendom, no one was documenting how pagan Baltic tribes had successfully resisted that expansion for centuries. The battles happened. The bodies in the ground prove it. The sudden cessation of Swedish expansion into the region proves it. The occasional oblique references in later sources prove it. But the detailed accounts, the names of heroes, the specific tactics and strategies, the cultural context that would let us fully understand and appreciate what was achieved, all of that was lost when oral tradition was destroyed by Christian conquest 2 centuries later. We're left with shadows, fragments, and graves that testify to victories that no saga celebrates. The Livonians and Semigallians won their wars. They just lost the memory of having won them, and that might be the most complete victory their enemies ever achieved. Section 5. The Legacy. Why you've never heard this story. So, let's address the obvious question. If the Livonians and Semigallians were so effective at resisting Viking expansion, if they won battles and forced one of medieval Europe's most successful warrior cultures to fundamentally change their strategy, why have you never heard of them? The answer reveals something profound about how history gets written, who gets remembered, and how entire peoples can be erased from historical memory even when they won. How this changed Viking behavior. The impact of Baltic resistance on Swedish Viking strategy was immediate and lasting, even if it was never explicitly acknowledged in Norse sources. By the mid to late 1100s AD, the pattern of Swedish activity in the eastern Baltic had fundamentally shifted. The large-scale raiding expeditions stopped. The attempts to establish fortified settlements ceased. The campaigns of conquest that had characterized the 1000s and early 1100s simply didn't happen anymore. This wasn't because the Swedes suddenly lost interest in the region. The economic incentives were still there. The trade routes through the Baltic to Byzantium and the Islamic world were still profitable. The furs, amber, and slaves were still valuable. What changed was the Swedish understanding of what was possible and what the costs would be. Instead of conquerors, Swedish Vikings came to the Baltic as traders operating on terms set by the local populations. They established trading relationships at coastal settlements, where the Livonians and Semigallians were willing to trade. They paid tolls and tributes to pass through territories they'd once hoped to dominate. They brought goods to exchange rather than weapons to take. In some ways, this was actually more profitable than conquest would have been. Trade doesn't require the massive investment of men and resources that occupation demands. It doesn't create the constant security problems that come with ruling hostile populations. The Swedes who traded peacefully in the Baltic probably did better economically than the ones who died trying to conquer it. But this shift was never celebrated in Swedish culture. Norse society glorified warriors and conquerors, not merchants who paid tribute to peoples they'd once hoped to dominate. The jarls and warriors who'd failed to conquer the Baltic weren't commemorated in sagas. The shift from attempted conquest to peaceful trade wasn't framed as a strategic adaptation, but simply happened quietly over decades. Some later Norse sources contain oblique references that hint at this history. Occasional mentions of dangerous peoples of the eastern forests, or lands where warriors go to die. These fragmentary references suggest that some memory of the conflicts persisted in oral tradition, even if the details were suppressed, but they're brief, vague, and rarely elaborated upon. The clearest evidence of changed behavior is simply the absence of further attempts at conquest. After the mid-1100s AD, there are no records of major Swedish military expeditions into Livonian or Semigallian territory until the Northern Crusades of the late 1200s, and even those crusades were led by Germans, not Swedes. The Swedish Vikings had learned their lesson, even if they refused to explicitly acknowledge what that lesson had been. The erasure from history. The story of how the Livonians and Semigallians were erased from historical memory involves multiple layers of suppression, each building on the last, until the original reality was almost completely obscured. Layer 1. Viking silence. Norse saga tradition was highly selective about what it celebrated. Sagas commemorated victories, clever strategies, heroic deaths in battle, and the deeds of great warriors. What they didn't celebrate was humiliating defeat at the hands of peoples the Norse considered inferior. This wasn't necessarily conscious propaganda. It was the natural tendency of oral tradition to emphasize stories that reinforced cultural values and suppress stories that challenged those values. A skald composing an epic poem for a jarl's hall wasn't going to spend much time describing how that jarl's father lost 200 men to forest ambushes and starvation. That's not the kind of story that gets you fed and housed. The result was a systematic bias in what got remembered and eventually written down. Viking successes in England, Ireland, Francia, and the Mediterranean were celebrated in elaborate detail. Viking setbacks in the eastern Baltic were, at best, obliquely referenced or completely ignored. When the sagas were finally written down in Iceland during the 1200s and 1300s AD, this bias became permanent. The oral tradition that might have contained more complete accounts was crystallized into written form that emphasized Western expansion and downplayed Eastern failures. Future generations would read about Viking conquests in far-flung lands and never learn about the peoples who successfully resisted those conquests close to home. Layer 2. Christian Chronicles. The second wave of erasure came with the Christian Chronicles written during and after the Northern Crusades. Starting in the late 1100s AD, German crusading orders, primarily the Livonian Brothers of the Sword and later the Teutonic Knights, began systematic conquest of the Baltic region. This conquest was framed explicitly as a religious mission, bringing Christianity to pagan peoples who supposedly lived in darkness and barbarism. The chronicles written to justify and document these crusades had every reason to portray the Baltic peoples as primitive, disorganized, and in desperate need of Christian civilization. Acknowledging the military sophistication of the Livonians and Semigallians, their successful resistance against Viking expansion, or their complex social and spiritual traditions would have undermined the entire justification for the Crusades. So, the Chronicles told a very different story. They described the Baltic tribes as savage pagans engaged in demon worship and human sacrifice. They portrayed the land as a wilderness of superstition and cruelty. They framed Christian conquest as liberation rather than subjugation. The military resistance that the Crusaders encountered was described as the desperate struggles of primitives against the inevitable march of civilization. These chronicles became the primary written sources for Baltic history during this period. They were preserved, copied, and distributed throughout Christian Europe. They became the foundation for how later historians understood the region, and they systematically erased or distorted everything that contradicted their narrative of Christian civilizing mission. The irony is almost unbearable. The German crusaders who wrote these chronicles struggled for decades to conquer peoples that Swedish Vikings had never managed to permanently subdue. The Livonians and Semigallians fought the crusaders with the same tactical sophistication and desperate courage they'd shown against the Vikings. But the chronicles credited eventual Christian victory to divine providence rather than military superiority, and they portrayed the defenders as primitives rather than sophisticated warriors. Layer 3. Destruction of oral tradition. But perhaps the most devastating form of erasure was the systematic destruction of Baltic oral tradition itself. When the Crusaders finally conquered the region in the 1300s AD, they didn't just impose political control, they engaged in deliberate cultural annihilation. Sacred groves, the spiritual centers of Livonian and Semigallian society, were cut down and churches built on their ruins. Traditional rituals were banned under pain of death. The old songs that preserved history and cultural memory were forbidden. Storytellers who continued their craft were persecuted as witches or demon worshippers. Children were forcibly baptized and removed from their families to be raised in Christian institutions, where they were taught to reject the traditions of their ancestors. The use of native languages was discouraged or prohibited in many areas. Intermarriage between Germans and natives was encouraged as a way to dilute indigenous culture. Every institution that preserved and transmitted oral tradition was targeted for elimination. Within 2 or 3 generations, the vast oral literature of the Livonians and Semigallians was simply gone. The epic poems about victories against Viking invaders, the detailed tactical knowledge encoded in story and song, the genealogies stretching back centuries, the spiritual traditions that had given meaning to resistance, all of it vanished. A few fragments survived in folk traditions, in children's songs, in half-remembered stories told in secret. Latvian and Lithuanian folk traditions today contain echoes of the old ways. But the connected, comprehensive tradition that could have told us exactly who the Livonians and Semigallians were, how they fought, what they believed, and why they succeeded in resisting Viking expansion for so long, was destroyed so thoroughly that we can barely reconstruct it. This was cultural genocide in the most literal sense, not just the killing of people, though plenty of that happened, but the deliberate murder of a culture, the erasure of a people's ability to remember and transmit their own story. Layer 4. Modern nationalism. The final layer of erasure came much later, with the rise of modern nationalism in the 1800s and 1900s. When historians began writing national histories for the emerging nation-states of Europe, the Baltic tribes didn't fit convenient narratives. German nationalist historians emphasized the civilizing mission of Germanic peoples, bringing order to the barbaric East. Russian historians focused on the Slavic principalities and downplayed or ignored the Baltic tribes who'd resisted Russian expansion, as well as Viking and German conquest. Swedish historians celebrated Viking Age expansion and trading empires while glossing over the failures and limitations. Even in Latvia and Lithuania, when those nations gained independence in the early 20th century, nationalist historians often preferred to emphasize later resistance against Russian or German domination rather than the earlier tribal period. The Livonians and Semigallians were presented as primitive ancestors who eventually evolved into the modern nations rather than as sophisticated societies in their own right. The result was that from every national perspective, the Baltic tribes became footnotes or obstacles in someone else's story of progress and nation building. Their own achievements, their successful resistance, their military and cultural sophistication remained unexamined and unappreciated. What we're learning now. Only in the last few decades has this begun to change, and the change is coming primarily from archaeology rather than written sources. Excavations across Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia have revealed a picture of Baltic tribal society that contradicts almost everything the biased written sources suggested. The hill forts weren't simple wooden palisades, but sophisticated defensive systems with multiple layers of fortification, clever use of terrain, and engineering that required coordinated labor and advanced planning. Some of these fortifications show evidence of construction and modification over centuries, suggesting long-term strategic planning rather than reactive defense. Weapon hoards and individual graves have revealed metalworking skills that rival anything produced in Scandinavia during the same period. Baltic smiths could work iron, bronze, and even gold with considerable sophistication. The weapons they carried into battle weren't crude clubs, but well-forged spears, swords, and axes. Some items show decorative work of remarkable quality, indicating that these were peoples with strong artistic traditions and the leisure time to develop them. Trade goods found in Baltic excavations demonstrate connections across the known medieval world. Arabic coins, Byzantine glass, Scandinavian jewellery, all found in contexts that show the Baltic tribes weren't isolated forest dwellers but active participants in medieval trade networks. They were trading as equals with their neighbours, not as primitives overwhelmed by superior civilizations. The mass graves of Scandinavian warriors, found at multiple sites across the region, tell their own story. These weren't men who died in glorious battles celebrated in sagas. They were men who died in ambushes, outnumbered and far from home, buried quickly and without ceremony. Each grave represents an untold story of defeat, a raid that went wrong, a battle that the sagas never mentioned. Modern forensic analysis of these remains reveals details about how these battles were fought. Multiple wounds from different directions indicate being surrounded and overwhelmed. Blade marks on bones show the specific types of weapons used. The positions of bodies suggest attempts to form defensive positions that were eventually overrun. The archaeology tells us stories that the written sources deliberately omitted. Linguistic research has also begun to reveal more about Baltic tribal culture. By analysing the loanwords, place names, and fragments of vocabulary that survived into modern Latvian and Lithuanian, scholars can reconstruct aspects of the original cultures. Terms related to warfare, fortification, and military organisation are surprisingly sophisticated, suggesting complex military traditions that simply weren't documented by outside observers. Environmental archaeology has shown how the Baltic tribes used landscape as a weapon. Analysis of pollen samples, soil composition, and ancient vegetation patterns reveals deliberate modification of terrain for defensive purposes. Forests were managed to provide concealment for defenders while impeding invaders. Marshes were maintained or even expanded to create barriers. River channels were modified to control access. This wasn't primitive people lucky enough to live in defensible terrain. This was sophisticated environmental engineering deployed for military purposes. Perhaps most importantly, modern scholarship has begun to challenge the assumption that absence of written sources equals absence of complexity. Oral tradition isn't inferior to written tradition, it's simply different. The societies that relied on oral transmission of knowledge, history, and culture weren't less sophisticated than literate societies. They simply organized and preserved information differently. The tragedy is that we're learning all this hundreds of years too late. We can reconstruct fragments of what was lost, glimpse outlines of sophisticated military traditions and complex societies. But the voices themselves, the actual words and songs and stories that the Livonians and Semigallians used to understand and transmit their own history, those are gone forever. We can know that they defeated Viking raiders. We can see the evidence of battles the sagas never mentioned. We can appreciate the sophistication of their tactics and the effectiveness of their resistance. But we'll never hear their version of events. We'll never know the names of the heroes who led the defense. We'll never hear the victory songs they sang around fires after battles won. The broader lesson, the story of the Livonians and Semigallians, teaches us something crucial about historical memory and who gets to be remembered. History isn't just written by the victors. History is written by those who write. And, for most of human history, writing was a rare and specialized skill concentrated in the hands of religious institutions, governmental bureaucracies, and cultural elites. The peoples who lacked writing, or who chose to maintain knowledge through other means, were at a fundamental disadvantage in the contest for historical memory. This creates a profound distortion in our understanding of the past. We know vastly more about cultures that produced extensive written records than about cultures that didn't, regardless of their actual historical significance or achievements. We can read detailed accounts of Viking raids because Vikings eventually adopted writing and their stories were recorded. We have only shadows and fragments about the peoples who defeated those raids because they maintained oral traditions that were destroyed before anyone thought to write them down. The Livonians and Semigallians won their wars against Viking expansion. They developed sophisticated military tactics. They coordinated across tribal boundaries. They used terrain, psychology, and strategic patience to defeat one of medieval Europe's most effective warrior cultures. By any reasonable measure, they were successful. But they lost the longer war for historical memory. And that loss was so complete that most people today have never heard of them, don't know their stories, and have no idea that Viking expansion in the east was stopped not by other Vikings, but by Baltic peoples fighting to defend their sacred lands. This has implications beyond just this one historical case. How many other successful resistance movements, other sophisticated cultures, other important historical actors have been erased from memory simply because they didn't have writing, or because those who did write had reasons to ignore or distort their stories? The archaeological recovery of Baltic tribal history is important not just for understanding the Vikings or medieval warfare. It's important because it challenges us to think critically about whose stories get preserved and whose get erased. It reminds us that absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. And it demonstrates that sometimes the most effective resistance is the resistance that later gets written out of the story. The Swedish Vikings who survived encounters with the Livonians and Semigallians returned home changed. They brought back stories, though not the kind of stories that got carved on runestones or celebrated in halls. They brought back fear. They brought back respect for enemies they'd underestimated. And they brought back a hard-learned lesson about the limits of Viking power. Those lessons shaped Swedish behaviour in the Baltic for generations. The shift from conquest to trade, the recognition that some peoples simply couldn't be subdued, the understanding that terrain and determination could defeat superior equipment and organisation, all of this became part of the collective, if rarely articulated, Swedish understanding of the East. But the Baltic defenders who made that lesson possible were never celebrated in the histories written by their enemies. The Livonians who ambushed raiding parties, the Semigallians who pursued Swedish forces through winter forests, the countless unnamed warriors who defended their sacred groves and villages with skill and courage that would rival any hero of Norse saga. They won their battles and lost their place in history. Until now, the archaeology continues. Every excavation season brings new finds, new evidence, new pieces of a puzzle we're only beginning to assemble. Mass graves reveal untold battles. Weapon hoards demonstrate forgotten martial traditions. Defensive structures showcase engineering sophistication that challenges our assumptions. The ground itself is telling stories that the written sources tried to erase. We can't fully recover what was lost. The songs are silent, the sacred groves are gone, the oral tradition is shattered beyond repair, but we can at least acknowledge what happened. We can recognize that the peoples who resisted Viking expansion in the Eastern Baltic weren't primitive victims of history, but active agents, who shaped their own destinies and influenced the course of medieval European development. We can remember that sometimes the most important victories are the ones that don't get celebrated in sagas. That the absence of written records doesn't mean the absence of achievement. That effectiveness in war isn't always measured by who writes the chronicle afterward. The Livonians and Semigallians made the Vikings fear to tread their lands. They defended their territories, their traditions, and their sacred spaces with such skill and determination that Swedish expansion was permanently altered. They demonstrated that Viking power had clear limits, and that those limits could be enforced by peoples who understood their own strengths and their enemies' weaknesses. They won wars that history tried to forget. This is their story, reconstructed from fragments and shadows, recovered from the ground itself, told despite the efforts of centuries to erase it. It's a story about the brutal tribes who were left out of the Viking Sagas. Not because they lost, but because they won too well and refused to be conquered by anyone, even by historical memory. The forests of the Eastern Baltic have kept their secrets for 1,000 years, but the earth remembers what the chronicles chose to forget. And now, finally, we're learning to listen.